So, class, here we are. We're going to begin our history notes. So I'd like you to turn to the history notes section in your book, and you can, or in your notebook, and you can look at the date. The date is 3/31 if you're the Tuesday class, or it's 4/2 if you're the Thursday class. So you would circle that date, and you can take notes just like we've done for 25 straight weeks in our normal regular classes. Now we're at lesson 29, so let's continue what we've been doing all year. Last week, we talked a lot about Julius Caesar, so I'd like you to write these notes down, and these are a review, kind of a quick review, and we said that Caesar was a famous general, and he crossed the Rubicon River, which was a no-no. You're not supposed to take your army across the Rubicon and come into Rome. However, he broke the law, and he brought his army into Rome, and people went wild. They thought he was great. He was, they thought, defending Rome from chaos and corruption. So things were very chaotic. Chaotic means it was without order. There was a lot of breakdown of law and order and rule. So Caesar now decides to really say and to appoint himself a dictator. So he's self-appointed Dictator of Rome. Okay, and he's thinking about becoming an emperor, but he's the sole ruler, and he rules Rome from 49 to 44 BC. And then you all know that the men stepped forward to assassinate him. We talked about the assassination of Caesar last week, and that takes place on the Ides of March. So March 15th, 44 BC, he is killed by the conspirators. So he has a death there. Now that's pretty much where we're starting off with, because now with Caesar's death comes a new person who steps into the arena to rule Rome, and he is known as Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus. Now, that's really his name as emperor of Rome, and he is actually the first real emperor, Caesar Augustus. But before he becomes Caesar Augustus, he's known as Octavius. Octavius. And so he, at first, shared power with two other people. And you guys know from the story of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, who were those two guys, two men that he shared power with? Okay, if you guessed, Octavius shared power with Mark Antony. So Mark Antony. And then another man, Lepidus. And so the three of them shared power in Rome, and because there were three, they called themselves the Triumvirate. Now, viri means man, so this is trium, of course, means three-man rule. That's what a triumvirate is, it's three people. And very shortly afterwards, Lepidus is killed. So actually, he's brutally assassinated. So Lepidus, and you kind of see what happens now with this idea of emperors. There's a lot of assassinations. So this becomes a real affliction for Rome. So Lepidus is killed, and now Antony and Octavius are going to fight for power. So they're going to fight for power, and a war breaks out across the Roman Empire. So Antony and Octavius fight for power. They want to be the sole ruler of Rome. And so Antony begins finding ways that he can influence some of the parts of the empire and kind of make his position stronger. So he gives Roman territory to Cleopatra. And Cleopatra, of course, is the queen of Egypt. And so Antony gives her territory, and of course winning her hand, winning her support. It's like he's building an ally with Cleopatra. Now, about that time, Antony is in Egypt. Octavian sails a fleet toward Egypt, and Antony hears about it. He sails out with his fleet, and there is a battle. And at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian defeats Antony. And Antony dies and is defeated in this battle. And Cleopatra actually kills herself. So she is, because she's the ally and she knows that having that position, they're probably going to kill her. The Roman emperor, Octavian, who's now the sole ruler, is probably going to kill her. And so she allows her, she has a very poisonous snake, a viper, in a basket, and sticks her hand into this basket. The snake strikes her, and in a few minutes, she's dead. So, with the death of Antony, Octavian becomes Caesar Augustus. He sets himself up as the only ruler over Rome, and as emperor declares himself to be a god, and he gives himself the title Caesar Augustus. Augustus means revered one, revered. To revere means you honor and you esteem, even in a way of looking at the person as somewhat holy and set apart. So this is almost a religious title that they give to Augustus. And Augustus restores order to the empire. And so starting with his reign, peace comes over the empire. And this is known as the Pax, which means peace, Romana, which means of Rome. And so the peace of Rome is prevalent over the empire, beginning with Augustus, and then it continues to about 180 AD. So for about 210 years, from 30 BC to 180 AD, the Pax Romana is prevalent over Rome. We're going to talk about that Pax Romana now for a few minutes, and why is this such an important time? So as we consider this Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, Pax Romana, there's a few things that we ought to consider about this time. It's a real time of safety. The Roman legions are predominant. They are not really challenged very much. There are some small wars that Rome fights, but by and large, there's this relative peace, and it kind of settles over the entire empire. Now, during this time of peace, the empire is extended. So Rome expands and takes in a number of areas. And so the empire grows. It's extended. And the Roman legions are extremely strong. So they're strong legions. These are units of 6,000 men who were well trained, well equipped. And so I think maybe this time is a great example of how a strong military can help have a time of peace. Now, the negative, the downside of having a very strong military is that it's easy then for an emperor to arise by just controlling the military. And so the Romans do this, and this is one of the lessons that we see in history, is and one of the reasons, honestly, that the United States has the military under civilian control. It's never under a military commander, like a former general who has seized power. No, the president is the commander-in-chief, and he is separate from any link to controlling the military as a military person. He's controlling it as a civilian. And of course, if you don't like how the president does with the military, if you don't like, for instance, President Bush going into the Middle East and taking Saddam Hussein, waging war against him, and the things he does, what do? Well, you vote for another president. So he only has a 4-year term. So this was one of the lessons that we get from the Romans, that the empire was extended really due to very strong legions. Now, another thing that they had was a real strong organization. So the Romans were very organized. And I would say this organization is probably the key thing. And this enables them to rule over a vast area. And when you consider the Roman Empire, how big it was, this is really amazing that they were able to rule effectively from Rome over this very, very big area. They develop a bureaucracy. So a bureaucracy is government officials that carry out policies in these far-flung areas of the empire. They also had a permanent army. So one of the things that the Romans do is they pay their soldiers, and they require that when the man comes into the army, that he agrees to stay for a number of years. So he's a professional. This becomes a profession. Now, there's an advantage to that. You have a very stable army. Can you think of a disadvantage? Yeah, the army can become so strong that it can squash the liberties of the people. And that happens in the Roman Empire. So let's consider that. A very, very strong army can be a danger to liberty. Let's consider a little bit about how did the Roman Empire prepare things for the gospel. We know that the gospel spreads during Rome. In fact, we know that Jesus lives during the period of the Roman Empire. If you remember, the story in Luke actually says that Tiberius was the emperor when Jesus was born. So it actually speaks of that right there in Luke chapter 1. So let's look at the preparation. Number one, we have these Roman roads that become so valuable to preparing for the gospel, because now people can reach all over the empire very quickly by using these very nice roads the Romans built for the legions to march to and fro, now are being used by the gospel. So what was used by legions for a military use now is used to spread the gospel. You could say, in some ways, the same thing happened in the United States, because the interstate road system, or even before that, when they were building the U.S. highway system, all these highways crisscross America were built a lot with tax money from the federal government. So all the U.S. highways and all the interstate roads were built that way. But now Christians can use them for missions, for traveling between towns and cities, and we sure see that happening. Secondly, we see the spread of the Greek language. So this beautiful language is spread throughout the Greek Empire of Alexander, but now it's still there. All these people had learned Greek, and they still know it. So Greek is the language of the New Testament. As the New Testament writers write, Greek is the main language of the entire Roman world. Everybody knows Greek because Greek is used everywhere for business and culture. So the culture and the language of Europe and Asia and Egypt and that whole region was Greek. And we remember that term for that was that the world had been Hellenized. Hellenization was bringing that Greek culture throughout all of those countries. Now, a third thing that happens here that prepares the gospel, or actually prepares Rome for the gospel, is Romans were given citizenship. There was Roman citizenship for many citizens. And what did that offer? Protection. So there was protection for many Roman citizens. In fact, Paul uses this because he's a Roman citizen. He wasn't born in Rome. He was born in Tarsus, which is up in the Turkey area today, called Asia Minor. And this citizenship enables him protection for when people want to kill him. And he actually uses this to go to Rome and present the gospel to the highest officials there in Rome. Now, also, we see that the Jews in Palestine were looking for the Messiah. The Messiah, Jesus, we know, is the Messiah. And then, of course, he dies on the cross after suffering for our sin and paying the price for all the sin of the world. And then he is raised from the dead and he ascends into heaven. And this all happens there in Palestine. So the Jews are looking for this Messiah. So the Jews in the Palestine area were looking for the Messiah, and several points that are important to mention at this stage. Because they're looking for the Messiah, God uses several things here. He has Palestine under Roman control, and so there's a stability at this time. It's easy, for instance, as Jesus is doing his ministry, he can walk all over Israel. He walks north to the Sea of Galilee. He goes south down to the Jordan River. He is free. There's freedom because the Romans have exerted control. There's safety. So this is a good time, and it's the time that God selects for Jesus. And so the Jews see, really you could say all of the Jews are exposed to the ministry of Jesus. Also, the king in Palestine, King Herod, learns about Jesus, and of course he's the guy who is jealous of control, and he tries to kill all the babies that are less than 2 years old in trying to defend his throne. So kind of a sad commentary about King Herod. Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor, and Pilate's the governor when Jesus is brought to justice, I wouldn't say he's brought to justice, that's not a good way of referring to it, but when he's brought to trial, Pontius Pilate washes his hands and says what? Do you all remember? Yeah, you remember that? Sure. He says this man hasn't done anything wrong, and he washed his hands of the decision to put Jesus to death. Of course, Tiberius was the Roman emperor that's mentioned. We mentioned him earlier before, and the Roman, and all the Romans and the Jews of that area had the Septuagint. The Septuagint was all the Old Testament scriptures, so it had all of the 39 books of the Old Testament put into Greek. So they had been translated into Greek. Now this had been accomplished by 70 scholars, so septua is the word for 70. So these men had put this into the Greek language. And so we see that this whole time was prepared, and we understand that Christ is really the turning point in history. We're going to look next at a timeline, so I want you to put some dates. We're just going to make a list of dates that you can see on a timeline. So thank you. We'll turn to that now.